So I'm really excited to segue into our next presentation. I'll be introducing our next moderator, who, if you were able to join us yesterday, you would have seen her amazing presentation that really did a great job of laying the groundwork of how some of the techniques that we've been seeing in these next presentations really came over from Europe. Mary Cheek Mills is our moderator. I've had the joy of working with her often over my reign here at the museum, especially on a fantastic exhibit about the work she's been doing at AECOM. So she's overseen that first exhibit, the From the Ground Up, Archaeology, Artisans, and Everyday Life. At AECOM, she's the historic glass specialist, and so is directing their archaeology center, which is a public laboratory and interpretive gallery, which is opening up in Philly. So I can't wait for COVID to go away so we can go see that. Prior to do this work at AECOM with the archaeology in the Kensington area, she was an education programs manager at Corning Museum of Glass. She's a great educator and has taught, I know me, so much about glass. Has also formerly taught classes at Winterthur for Cooper Hewitt. And coming up, she's going to be the Tyler School of Art and Architecture, Lori Wagman Glass Historian in Residence, which I'm really excited to follow. She comes to us with a degree in public history, and as well as from the Winterthur program in early American material culture. So thank you so much for joining us for this symposium, Mary. And I will hand it over to you.
Many thanks to Kristen for the lovely introduction, and a big welcome to all of our participants. And I hope that you were able to see some of the presentations yesterday and this morning. And I think you'll really enjoy what we have this afternoon. So it's my privilege to have an opportunity to introduce Gay LeCleire Taylor. Gay is an independent curator and glass consultant, and is the former director and curator for WheatonArts, or I should say the Museum of American Glass at WheatonArts. During her tenure of over 30 years at the museum, she organized over 30 exhibitions, and she has published extensively, many wonderful exhibition catalogs that I know glass historians depend on a great deal, and she's published many articles as well. Gay has taught classes for the Mid-Atlantic Association of Museums, the University of Delaware, Winterthur Museum, and Rowan University. She has also identified the glass collection for the Barnes Foundation for the Pew Charitable Trust. Some of you may not realize that the Barnes Foundation has this incredible collection of glass. And Gay is currently the secretary of the National American Glass Club, and she's the former president of the National American Glass Club. She's a past member of the board of the Paperweight Collectors Association, and is also a member of their Publications Review Committee. And she has served on several local South Jersey arts boards and committees. And I must say that Gay has been a very dear friend of mine and an incredible mentor throughout my entire career. So I'm honored to welcome Gay.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Mary. I've so much enjoyed everyone's talks today and the wonderful demonstration that we just saw. But now we're really going to concentrate on the impact of immigration on South Jersey glassmaking. And for those of you who don't know the history of New Jersey, we really just need to set the stage. And that was the first European settlements in southern New Jersey. First was New Sweden, and then the New Netherlands settlement. And this no wars, but a turnover of the lands. King Charles II in 1664 gives the land to his brothers, and then he gives it to George Carteret and John Berkeley. And then Berkeley sells the land to William Penn, and the state is divided in half into East and West Jersey. But interestingly enough, William Penn and his group of buyers are buying buying West Jersey before Philadelphia is even settled. And in 1681, William Penn settles Pennsylvania and Philadelphia. And this is the earliest view that we have of the city of Philadelphia in 1718. And in 1717, Caspar Wistar, who we're going to really talk about, arrives in Philadelphia from the Palatinate region of Germany. Now, William Penn had traveled to Germany to try and convince people to become Quakers. And immediately when he founded his settlement, he paid out pamphlets to Germans to get them to come to the colony for religious freedoms. And it wasn't just the Germans and German Lutherans that he was trying to encourage, but also Scots-Irish, Swiss Mennonites, Swedes, and French Huguenots were all welcome in the colony, but predominantly it was the German immigrants that were settling. So much so that in 1727, the Pennsylvania Council was worrying that too many Germans were settling in in Philadelphia, and they made them pledge allegiance to the crown in 1727. And boats were actually met in the harbor. The adult men 16 or over were brought to the courthouse. They swore their allegiance and then could go back to the boats and get their family. And it was to this world that Caspar Wistar arrives in 1717. He says that Germans weren't treated that well, and he really needed to make his way. First, he shoveled and wheelbarrowed ashes for a soap maker, and then apprenticed to make buttons, and makes his famous brass buttons that brings him his fortune and the ways for him to make his living in the New World. Caspar Wistar came from a really controlled environment where electors in Germany owned all the land. His father and his grandfather worked as foresters and knew that he really couldn't move any further up by staying in Germany. And so he decided to come to the colony of Pennsylvania. And he knew to become a worker there, he needed to first become a Quaker, so he does, and he marries, and he also becomes a naturalized citizen, which allowed him to buy land. And what he saw in South Jersey was the forests. He wrote a 6-page memoir where he said the thing that most identified himself was the forest and the wood choppers and the hunters that control the forest. And he knew that if he had wood and that kind of land, that he could become a successful business person. And so Southern New Jersey was covered with forest. And then even today, with the Pine Barrens, New Jersey is really 42% of forest. So he buys a patch of land after several others and acres in 1738, and decides that he wants to build a glass factory. And the world between Germany and the colony of Pennsylvania was very fluid. Information, materials, and supplies were passing back and forth. So he decides to set up a glass factory in Alloway, New Jersey, near Salem, New Jersey, and on the creek to start a glass factory. He's not a glassman, but he knows that this land is possible for making glass. And all these early maps, which don't even have other kinds of towns, you can find either the glass house listed or the glass H period for the section where his factory is actually located on early maps. So he brings over 4 German workers to set up this glass factory. He pays their passage, he provides them housing, and also the capital to make the glass works. And he'll have 2/3% of the profit, and they'll have 1/3. And they're also agreed to teach glass blowing to Caspar Wistar, his son, and other workers that might go to the factory. So they come in 1738. They pledge their allegiance to the crown and go on and open the glass factory. We do have one survey map that shows what the factory looked like. This sort of line where the word Wisterberg is Commissioner's Pike, if you know where that is, in Alloway, New Jersey, and sets up a glass factory. Caspar Wister knew what Philadelphia needed, and what they needed was window glass and bottles, things that he could sell easily in the city. And these Germans brought the German style of making window glass, which was to blow a cylinder, which would be scored and then flattened out to make economical pieces of glass, very different from the English or crown method that was being done in England. And also that the colonists needed bottles and supplies, things to put their food in. And again, very Germanic in style of bottles and containers that were being produced. So the factory was very successful. Caspar Wister dies in 1752, and his son Richard takes over the factory. But the factory is sort of beginning to wane. It has been in operation since 1739. They begin to chop all the wood in their immediate region, need to go further afield to find their fuel. And then in 1768, the Stanger family comes. Germans to come to work in the Wister factory. By this point, Caspar Wister has died, but also all the 4 original glass blowers that have been associated with the factory had passed away. So they come to the factory in 1768 to work. We know Jacob Stanger will run away. Richard Wister put an ad for getting him back because he's an apprentice that needs to fill out his time. And the Stangers realized that the ending is about to come to this factory. So they look elsewhere to build the second factory in southern New Jersey. So here's a spot where the Alloway factory, the Wisterberg factory, is located. And they go inland following wood to make their glass house, and a very crude glass house it was in the beginning. It's called the Stanger Glassworks, but also Glass House. And today, of course, we know it's a famous town of Glassboro, New Jersey. So in 1779, they set up their small factory. And it was about 2.5 miles from the Rancocas Creek. It really wasn't on any kind of a waterway. So all of their glass that they produced would have to travel by land. And we know it's a small operation because in 1781, Pastor Nicholas Collins, a Swiss Lutheran minister, would come once a month and preach to the small gathering of glassblowers that were there. And they really weren't good businessmen, they were glassmen. And so they quickly lost control of the factory. And we don't know whether 1780, 1784 is the date where Heston and Carpenter partners come in and take over the factory, which they also called the Olive Glassworks. But even in 1802, Jacob Stanger, Daniel Stanger, Christian Stanger, the sons of the same family and the grandchildren of the Stanger family are operating the second glass factory in Glassboro after Wister had closed. Just on a note, this Olive Glassworks, T.W. Diet in Philadelphia is the sole agent for the Olive Glassworks and selling the things, the window glass and other items in Philadelphia for the Olive Glassworks. Another factory in New Jersey opens, Glassboro opens, the Harmony Glassworks, which eventually becomes the Whitney Brothers. They merge with Olive and become this huge glass factory. We always comment on this illustration that no one today that owned a factory would allow that kind of soot and smoke to be billowing out of their factory in an illustration that they're providing. But back then it meant prosperity and how successful the factory was. And these two factories merged into this huge conglomerate that eventually becomes the famous Owens, Illinois Glass Company in New Jersey. But moving on, after the 2 factories were initially started, one more factory in the 1700s was established in southern New Jersey, and that was a glass factory in Port Elizabeth. And Port Elizabeth is a sort of an isolated, very small region, But by act of the Continental Congress, Port Elizabeth, like Salem, was called a port of delivery. And it's actually where goods would come into Port Elizabeth and taxes and revenues could be raised for the Continental Congress. So Port Elizabeth was a fairly important place to have a glass factory, and up the Maurice River. And what the Maurice River had, which John mentioned in his talk, was incredible glass for glass making. That was fine grained. It could be shipped out by water to different places as far away as New England and elsewhere to be made good quality glass. The first factory was established by James Lee. And then it was eventually known as the Eagle Glassworks. And one of my favorite little ads saying that the Eagle Glassworks in 1813 is looking for a capable, sober man to run the factory. James Lee wasn't a glass blower, but he hired glass men to work for them. And the Stanger children were those workers that were hired. And just to show you the importance of wood and why wood was so important to factories is the sale of this factory was put up in 1815 and lists how many acres of land they have as part of their sale to encourage the next buyer to know that they had a source of fuel. And number 10 was 2,900 acres of timber, 7 miles from Millville. Which would be a good supply for the factory. It became known as the Eagle Glassworks. Getzingers, the family name under the third Eagle Glassworks, Catholic Germans were then running the factory in Port Elizabeth. And they made simple bottles, which is what New Jersey is about. The majority of factories in all of southern New Jersey made bottles or window glass. And this is a bill head that hasn't been restored yet at the Wheaton Museum, showing the prices that Getzinger was offering for his window glass. In Port Elizabeth, there was a second factory that was started in 1811. Operated to 1818. And the wonderful thing about this factory is not only were Stangers operating the factory, but they couldn't get along with their partners. So a court decision was made. And if you can see the dotted lines on the factory and the 4 little squares in blue, the factory was divided into 4 equal parts. And they either each got their own part to the shed on the side. 2 of them split the wharf. And 2 different factories operated under the same building in 1814 until 1818. And we had mentioned by Brian yesterday about Samuel Hufsey. And it's important to be able to talk about him because he's one of the few glass workers in southern New Jersey that we've known about his diary and how he talked about working in different factories and the things that was happening in his life. And he was born in 1801 in Port Elizabeth. So the first American generation of his family. And he wrote this journal, which unfortunately is lost, but excerpts from it are in the Gloucester County Historical Society. And it just lists the number of factories, 15 of them, that he would have worked at as an itinerant glass blower, traveling around from factory to factory, from Port Elizabeth to Hamilton, to Waterford, into Philadelphia, at Kensington, back to New Jersey, on all the way to Pittsburgh, where he rode on the Erie Canal to come home, and then other factories in southern New Jersey. And we had some questions about moving around yesterday from factory to factory, and these immigrant glass blowers and first generation glass blowers. And it was just more than looking for money. There were panics, real depressions that the country had where factories were shut down. Even the war in 1812, the British blockaded the Maurice River, and the Port Elizabeth factories could not get their wares out to market. And the Panic of 1818, 1837, which may be one of the most famous of these early depressions. and the Civil War then affected factories later on, but also a fire could destroy a factory and many of them closed down. An owner could die. A glassblower could marry someone in another family and move to another town that might have a glass factory they could work. Blasts or a factory would operate usually from September to June. And in the summertime, it would be too hot to work. Very often, the rivers froze over in the wintertime. Weather would be a factor. One of the things that Samuel Hufsey, which we wish he wrote more about, was in the summer of 1816, there was no summer. Crops froze in the fields and people were looking for food, and it was a real depression going on. Supposedly, he writes in his diary, there was a spot on the sun. And another reason to leave was religious reasons. Many of these glass blowers were very religious, and factories did not close down on Sunday and have a day of rest. So they pushed for that. And one of the reasons in his diary that Samuel Hufsey writes that he left the famous Diet factory in Kensington, Pennsylvania, is because Bodine and Bergen and Wood, and Bodine was a French Huguenot, agreed to have Sunday day of rest, which had to be planned for. If glass was in the furnace ready to melt on a Saturday afternoon, you worked into Sunday. So they had to plan for doing that. And this factory agreed in Millville that they would do it. And they have found other jobs. You know, when a factory didn't operate, they were could be on a ship, which Samuel Hufsey did, work on a farm, work in a general store. And this is just a list that Hufsey writes in his diary by order of all the different immigrants and other different glassblowers in southern New Jersey that he would work with as he traveled around to these 15 different factories and interacted. And we wish he had written so much more and his diary wasn't lost. James Lee moves up to Millville and establishes a glass factory in 1806, and the one on the left is the Upper Works, and Shutter Brothers do another glass factory downriver. The Whittle brothers take over that Millville glass factory, and they were Quakers. And the Whittle brothers teamed up with another Quaker, Tatum, and formed the Whittle Tatum Glassworks. And as Quakers, they refused to make liquor bottles, and that depleted what kind of production that factory would make. So there were over 224 glassmaking sites in New Jersey, and this is a really old map that I made years ago, but shows these different towns, all situated from southern New Jersey, that sprung up from immigrant glassblowers that founded them. And towns like Bridgeton had 20 glass factories in it, Millville 16, and really started the industry for the state. And some could be a very small factory, some could be a window glass factory, others could be large sites like the Williamstown Glass Factory Complex in this wonderful hexamer map view. But what New Jersey made, which was different from other states, is just bottles and window glass. They concentrated it, and their glass has that South Jersey aqua shade to it, which they didn't bother to take out, but could be anything from fruit jars to flasks to inkwells were being made. Very few factories made fine tableware. They were more in a city, and really less than a handful made fine tablewares in New Jersey. The one in Camden, the Capewell Glassworks, Capewell came from the Philadelphia area, took the ferry over and established his fine tableware glass factory. The other famous one was in Jersey City. The Dummer Glassworks would have made fine tablewares, but New Jersey stuck to bottles and window glass. And this is the kind of pieces that the workers would have made on their own time. We call it the South Jersey tradition, with a lily pad, traditional bowls and forms. And the workers made them for their family and friends, but they also made pieces that could be sold in the general store or the company's store right on the factory site for extra money. Mary had discussed this lily pad form on the bottom two pictures and designs that were being produced, and the white looping there with a picture, which is with its witchball stopper. So White-Old-Tatum in Millville will play an important role in the changing design of the pieces that the workers made on their own time or at the end of the day. And this is a 1900 photograph on cardboard, which shows some of the pieces that these workers made and actually exhibited for prizes that they were producing. And one of the most famous was Ralph Barber. As you can see, Ralph Barber was born in Manchester, England in 1869, and his family was brought over to the United States by John Christian Dorflinger to work in his glass factory in the Poconos, which John had mentioned that the Lutz brothers had gone there to work at a fine tableware factory. But Ralph Barber eventually travels to Millville and is credited with making the first and the best of the Millville roses that the workers made on their lunchtime with a crimp. And he was also a very skilled glassblower and made these beautiful loop pitchers that are in the Museum of American Glass. And he continues to work there till he passes away. But it's Dorflinger, where more than one factory family will come from Europe to work. When we talked about glass factories looking to bring in glass blowers and looking for the more skilled help than the average glass blowers that were working in southern New Jersey. So Ralph Barber not only worked at White-Old-Tatum, but becomes the manager of the Vineland Flint Glass Works. And he did some of these filigree designed pieces just to be able to show that he could have his skill when he could no longer make glass and was a little jealous of the art glass, which we'll talk about in a moment. John Rulander was born in the Hamburg area and came to the United States and began working at different factories, and again settles at White-Old-Tatum and starts to make loop pitchers and other kinds of designs, and is famous for the inkwell or umbrella paperweights that he produced. But you can see a theme going now as all of these workers that are making these offhand pieces that are White-Old-Tatum is recognized are immigrants. Here with the world's largest bottle at White-Old-Tatum that was made in 1903 and exhibited at the St. Louis World's Fair. All of the glass blowers, except for Tony, the son of Emil Stanger, were born in the Alsace-Lorraine region that borders between France and Germany, going back and forth. And we really believe that Emil Stanger's name was more the French spelling. And he then perfected Millville Rose paperweights, blown glass, and frit designs that were being produced. Michael Caine, another immigrant, this time from Ireland, made frit weights where the die was cut out and powdered glass was put in it and the designs were encapsulated. He's best known for the upright ship designs and some of his upright ones, and where the John Rulander was a tough person to work with. This is sort of dour picture we have here of Michael Caine, but he was a good union man, and he's wearing his union outfit. In the summer of 1899, a group of glassblowers, Ralph Barber, Emil Stanger, John Rulander, and Marcus Kuntz, got together to try and open a glass factory, which would be an exhibit glass factory where the visitors to Atlantic City could come in and watch glass blowing going on, sit in the bleachers, which you can see by the staircase and that upper level in the upper design of the factory, and watch glass blowing and buy glass that had been produced. We don't know too much if any glass was made there, but we do know from newspaper reports and a court decision that all of the hotels that bordered this factory in 1899 complained about the soot coming out of the factory, getting on the clothes, getting into the hotel rooms, and the factory was shut down that summer. we're looking at a venturing tabletop, which is really an Italian invention of having this glass that has copper or metallic particles floating into the surface. But these were done by Walsh brothers, English brothers that come to Janvier, New Jersey, and set up a small glass factory that doesn't operate for very long, making these venturine tabletops for tables and pieces of furniture. And these Walsh brothers were descendants and family members of the famous Walsh glass factory in England. But everything changes in 1903. Michael Owens invents the automatic bottle blowing machine. Now, this machine can make 16 bottles in 1 minute, and that's the first machine. You can't compete with this machine as an individual glass blower blowing piecework, and a factory can't compete with this and stay in business. And factories around the country, including Whittle-Tatum, started working on their own designs of machines. And by 1915, the machine has really been established in glass factories, and many factories closed that can't afford to put the machine in. You can't compete. A few hand shops did exist after the machine. The Victor Durand, who came from Baccarat, France, with his father and his brothers, set up eventually the Vineland Flint Glass Works in Vineland. That was making scientific glass, other industrial glass, towel bars for bathrooms. But Victor Durand always wanted to make good, high quality art glass. So he started the Durand Art Glass division of the Vineland Flint Glass Works, and is really the only art glass shop that was competing at the tail end of the glass being produced by Tiffany and Steuben, and hired workers that had worked at Quoizel and worked at Imperial to do these designs that Durand is recognized for. And this factory operated from 1924 to 1932, this division. And when we talk about death of an owner, this factory closed down because it wasn't profitable, and Durand, the Vineland Flint Glass Works had merged with the Kimball Glass Company, and Mr. Kimball didn't want to have a division that wasn't profitable, and he shuts the division down due to the death of Victor Durand. But this South Jersey tradition and interest in the South Jersey tradition really does continue, and it really influences glassmen who were working in these automated glass factories with a desire to continue to make the glass. So small backyard shops begin to open. The Clevenger Glass Works in Clayton, New Jersey opens in 1928, and the Clevenger brothers and a few others start to make reproductions of these South Jersey traditional pieces. And the Clevenger brothers over the years were hire retired glass blowers, or glass blowers would congregate there to continue to make the style in the South Jersey tradition. Depression comes. And the Works Progress Administration is set up not only to build roads and have murals painting, but also to help the glass industry in the state of New Jersey. And a closed down factory in Vineland becomes a Works Progress Administration factory, where they continue these traditional skills, but also replicate designs that artists, as part of the Works Progress Administration, set out and designed for the workers to make in this factory in Vineland. Emil Larsson, who was born in Sweden, and all of these glass blowers, there's so many different stories to tell about them. But he's a Swiss family. His father was a skilled glass blower at Costa. They wanted to move on, go to England to work for Bacchus, where we know unusual paperweights were being made at the Bacchus factory in England. It's not successful, and they decide to come, and Christian Dorflinger, here's another, brings the family over. The family story is that Emil Larsson and his sister wandered away from the train, and when the train was ready to leave to go to White Mills in the Poconos, Emma Larson and his sister were left behind. His family went on with the train, and that people took care of him in the train station, and they eventually got together. But can you imagine just how frightened he must have been taking care of his sister, let alone his family who had left him behind at the train station. So Emma Larson works at many different factories. At one point, gives it all up as a glass blower and opens a chicken farm in upstate New York, but gets lured back to glass blowing and works in the Durand art glass division for Victor Durand. But when that division closed, he works for a few other factories, but opens his own backyard shop in Vineland to produce glass. And he produces many different reproduction pieces and reproductions of the lily pads. And he works in this small factory from the late 30s to 1940s. And then in 1948, retires to Florida and lives out the last years of his life in retirement in Florida. But Emma Larson also revived the idea of the Millville Rose. The Millville Rose production had ended by as late as 1915, if not earlier, because of the machines that had gone into the factory. No longer do the workers have access to glass. So for nearly 30 years, the idea and style of being able to make a Millville Rose have been lost. And Emma Larson revived that. And then others followed who made other ones that were not as good and some that might be considered better. But Charles Pepper, Adolf Macko, Harry Caralucio, Bill Valla, and Skip Woods were known for making Millville Rose following after Emma Larson. August Hofbauer was born in Austria. And came and opened his own small factory, the Vineland Glass Company that made scientific glassware. He opened his small little plant also to make art glass, which he called Beacon Glass. And supposedly the name is Beacon because he owed so much money to the electric company that the electric company took interest in it, and it became known as Beacon for a beacon of light. And he worked this small operation. And the Beacon Glass factory closed, and then later on the Vineland Glass Company. And he decided to retire, but unfortunately his wife passed away, and so did his son in 1960. And he decides to go, and the invitation of the Colombian the Colombian government to open a glass factory in Bogota, which he does. He returns and works at a small little glass plant called the Jersey Bog Glass Company in Elwood, New Jersey, which the Messinas. So Ken Messina is sitting down, opening and closing the mold for August Hofbauer, and a little hand shop that sells glass is in Elwood, New Jersey also. One of my favorites is Adolf Macko, who was born in Czechoslovakia. He came to this country and worked in the Wheaton Glass Company as one of his last jobs, but he was just desperate to make glass, desperate to show the artwork that he could produce. So he opens a backyard shop, and there's a standard order that if he came to the gate at Wheaton, he could come in with his pickup truck, shove a cullet into the back of his pickup truck, and take it to his small little backyard shop and melt it down and make it to anything he wanted to. He made a really terrible example of the Millville Rose, but he tried, and he wanted to try and express himself artistically. And this is his replica of the lily pad pitcher here in blue, filled with bubbles and crude. They even said he melted down Coke bottles, and also had a mirror with overlay pieces embedded around the sides of it, which he unbolted and made them into paperweights. I just love him. Also, the Italian Club was established in Mildmay on the property of Matt Farabella. And the Italian Club, we had some questions about that, but the glass blowers, the individuals that came from Italy in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s were not skilled glass blowers, but their children and grandchildren eventually worked in many of the glass factories in the Vineland, Millville area on the machine. But they started a club in Milne, and the group together pooled their resources so they could buy batch and also buy fuel, which was really important to these backyard shops. And once they got enough money together, Matt had set the building up where the glass furnace was in the back, and in the front of the building was a kitchen with a facility and also cots. Because if you could afford to make a batch of glass, you kept it going until the glass was done. So many of these glass blowers would sit around and work the glass 24 hours, 48 hours, if anything was left after 72, and eat and drink and have a good time, and then sell the glass and start all over again. But a wonderful tradition in Milne. And Matt Farabelle is the last of these glass blowers that we're talking about in these backyard shops. He died in April at age 95. The other one to talk about is Ted Ramp, known for bad language and a bad temper. He worked at the Liberty Cut Glass Works in Egg Harbor, but opened his own backyard shop. One of the many stories about him was he usually packed a gun and carried a gun. And one time he was on a lunch break in a bar in Egg Harbor, and the clock struck the time he was supposed to get back to work. So he pulled out his gun and shot the clock to make the time stop so he wouldn't have to go back to the factory. And he was another one who, once he pulled his resources together to be able to blow glass, which is what he really wanted to do in life, his children and grandchildren dreaded it, because once that furnace was lit, they blew glass until all of the glass was done, which again could be 48 hours. And he worked them like a tyrant and dreaded the day he would light the furnace. This interest in South Jersey style glass continued. Liberty Village was established in Flemington, New Jersey. Doug Merritt was trained at the Jamestown Glass Works to make lily pad pieces, and they continued that. Liberty Village was eventually sold, became Vandermark Merritt, that made wonderful iridescent glass and paperweights. And then to end, Wheaton Village opened its doors. As we were saying, it's our anniversary. October the 23rd, which just passed in 1970, had its grand opening. And the first glass blowers were hired old timers. Bill Valla of Italian descent and Gene Crabtree made paperweights. And our first factory was a small little building that was also a cafe. The stained glass studio was used for many things until the original replica of the T.C. Wheaton factory was built. After those first glass blowers, more glass blowers were hired. Henry Davis, Tony Japama, Don Friel, and Joe Matson here, who's with my grandson blowing a bubble. My grandson is now in college. So from those small beginnings, those first four German glass blowers that came over to work for Caspar Wister, all the immigrants really affected the starting of the glass industry in New Jersey well into the 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gay. That was exactly the talk that we needed at this point, I think, to bring everything that we've been talking about all together. And it was just a perfect, wonderful summary of South Jersey glassmaking. We only have one question and then we'll move on. This is from Rita. She says, can you say more about unionization in the South Jersey industry? It seems that it was earlier than in, for instance, the coal industry.
Oh, I used to know all of this. It really was. unionized fairly early on. There were different labor movements that the glass industry joined into. And I'm not sure that I'm answering it right, but they did join unions early on.
Okay. Well, there are no other, oh, wait a minute. One more question, just a couple. How do we distinguish between German and British styles in general?
I look at the, there's the early pieces, where German factories were more of the forest glass with the dark green glass, to some of the clearer glasses that were being made in England, and those regions are a real distinction early on. When lead glass comes into England, a lot of the lead glasses were being produced where Bohemia and those regions in Germany stuck with some of the soda lime formulas and didn't use lead as early as a lot of the British factories did. I don't know if Mary, if you can address any other kinds of styles that would.
Well, I think speaking specifically about South Jersey and Kensington, I think what you said is pretty much it, that you get the lead glass colorless tableware, where the German tradition in this area stayed more with the blown and applied decoration that we talked about before. So that's what I would say. There are just a couple more questions. Oh, we're going away. Hang on. So did other states have similar glassmaking traditions in the 17 and 1800s?
Glass factories, do get built in the New England area and also New York State. What had many early glass factories. We don't have many glass factories in the South, where it was so much hotter. When you think of these early factories, there's still today, if you go into the studio at WheatonArts, it can be very, very warm. So glass factories tended to be a thing, and New York State had a lot of early glass factories, like New Jersey did. And then the glass factories that are localized in cities, such as Boston, such as those, are addressing more of the fine tablewares, where New Jersey is really focusing on bottles and window glass.
Okay, this is from Arlene Raven.
Hi, Arlene.
Says, Gabe, when I was young, there was still memory of backyard glass button makers. Do you know anything about that? Route 47, maybe?
There were a lot of button makers, but they were using the torch. Most of them were making small little buttons, which is what Charles Kasian, who starts the whole paperweight movement, working at the torch and making weights like so many of the artists do today. And many of them did have these little cottage industries, which we didn't tap on when John was talking, but many of those paperweights that were being done at Boston and Sandwich and at the New England Glass Companies, the workers made those parts at home. Once natural gas was piped into houses, they could easily make pieces for their paperweights or for the company's paperweights as piecework, bring them into the factory and be paid for them, just the way the button makers were making them.
Okay, and one quick one that I know you can answer very quickly. What's the source of sand for glass in South Jersey? I think you touched on that.
Well, the whole southern reach of the state inland has good working sand for glass blowing. The Maurice River, which is Maurice, but locally pronounced Morris River, has some of the finest glass making sand. It does have the impurities of the lead in it, so the glass will become that greenish color. I think probably Steuben uses a batch for the clear Steuben glass that was being produced. They found a very clean bed in Belgium. There's another very clean bed of sand out in Missouri that was found to make clear glasses. But good glass making sand for average pieces that could become up the whole southern region of interior New Jersey had glass making sand.
Okay, Gay, thank you again. We're going to keep moving. I am very pleased to have an opportunity to introduce Don Friel. Don, from a personal perspective, has always been so kind and welcoming to students that I used to bring to WheatonArts. So Don has been working with glass since the mid-1970s and started working at Wheaton Village in 1977. He received training in fine arts at the Rowan University in Glassboro, and he's taught at the Horizon Craft Center in Massachusetts, Hot Soup in Philadelphia, and Snow Farm, which is the New England craft program in Massachusetts. Don has exhibited his glass work in many group and solo shows within the US and extensively throughout New Jersey. These included a one-man show at the New Jersey State Museum in Trenton, and he was the recipient of a New Jersey State Fellowship in 1991. So Don's work has been published in the New England New Glass Review, the New York Times, and Art New Jersey. Don became the glass studio manager at WheatonArts in 1983 and served as the CGCA studio coordinator from 1983 to 1990. And he retired from WheatonArts just a couple of years ago. But fortunately, we've been able to walk in and still see him. Don, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Following is going to be a brief narrative about my early introduction into the world of glass and some of the people who were part of the learning experience for me. After graduating from high school in 1968, I enrolled in Gloucester County College as a business major. However, it turned out to be more like grade 13. The actual college wasn't finished, so our classes were held at a couple local high schools in the evening. Half my professors were teachers that I had in high school who had decided to make a career move up to college professors. After a year, I decided to quit college for a year so I could work and save some money to eventually go back to Glassboro College before it became Rowan. And unfortunately, during that time, my college deferment ran out and I was drafted. That would be the first actual lottery I would win in my life. After serving a little over 2 years in the 82nd Airborne, I became a civilian again. Sometime in May of '73, I decided then to take advantage of the GI Bill, enrolled in Glassboro State College. In the spring of '75, I discovered I had cancer on my left kidney, and it was removed. They didn't have chemo then, and they were just figuring out radiation therapy. So 5 days a week for 6 weeks, I drove to the VA hospital in Philadelphia for my treatments. I would get sick a bit on the ride home. At this period in time, I had made friends with Joe Matson. We met at a local pub where we would drink some beers, shoot some pool, and occasionally break up some bar fights. Joe was a non-matriculated student at Glassboro at the time who was taking classes in the ceramics department. He suggested I go to the studio with him after treatments and gave me a few lessons on the potter's wheel. This was something I had never considered before surgery, and that semester became a washout for me, but I was so enjoying the process of working with clay so much that I changed my major to the arts department. So one can say it's all Joe's fault. I became an artist. In the spring of 1976, Wheaton Village hired me as the first potter to work in Craft and Trades Row. Joe was hired to help care for the animals in the barn. We actually had a functioning barn for the first 2 years we were here. Also, that fall class was offered through Glassboro. And of course I took it. Why not? I was on a roll in this new life I was experiencing. The college would bus us down 2 days a week. The first time I visited the glass factory, there were 4 men working in the shop. Bill the Goat Valla and Gene Crabtree. They were working on some footed pictures with some looping decoration, and Henry Davis and William Honey were making some various South Jersey paperweights. I didn't know it then, but these men worked in glass houses, blowing many different products. So what I witnessed then was them making what would be considered some whimsies or end-of-the-day pieces that they would have enjoyed making after the end of a long shift. The Wheaton family started Wheaton Village in 1970. Here's a picture of Frank Wheaton Jr. And because of his vision and the support of his family, WheatonArts was built and opened in 1970. And if not that, my journey may have never started. The first successful glass house in America was located in Alloway, New Jersey. Opened its doors sometime in 1937. Over the next 200 years, there were over 100 to 200 glass houses built around New Jersey. When I was first introduced to glass in 1976, South Jersey was the leading producer of all types of glass products around the world. It was only fitting that the Museum of American Glass be built in the little factory town of Millville, New Jersey. After watching the men make their glass pieces for a while, we were finally given the opportunity to go to the furnace with a preheat pipe and get our first gathers of glass. And that's when I realized how hot it was inside that little furnace. I was still working in the pottery, taking classes at Glassboro, now learning how to blow glass. The old timers enjoyed watching us struggle. They didn't offer up lots of advice. They were old school, didn't share much knowledge with you until you earned their respect. I sometimes think none of this would happen had I not gotten drafted, met Joe, and lost a kidney to cancer. While this was going on, Gene Crabtree retired to Florida. Ron Goldstein was hired to help with increased numbers of tours that were now coming to visit our grounds, mostly schools and senior groups. So Ron had to leave. The day he drove off the grounds, I walked up to Barry Taylor's office and asked for Ron's position. I would now officially be blowing glass for a living. So what I've put on the screen here are a few of the last pieces that I actually made. They were put away in a box and I didn't find them for 20 years. And I'm grateful that I still have them in my collection. So this was just a little bit of applied decoration, all salt glazed. Next. This was a large lidded bowl that I had made, just stood in one of the back shelves in the pottery, I'll bet you, for 15 years before Terry gave it back to me. And these two, there were more, but these were the ones that I was fondest of at the point. And believe it or not, I never went back and threw another pot after that venture, walking from one building to the other. So at the time, the studio staff was Bill Valla, Henry Davis, Bill Heinley, me, Joe, Eileen Matson, and Wayne Hopman. While the three older men made paperweights and some pictures for the demonstration, the rest of us started learning to use the press molds, dump out molds, bottle molds to make work for the stores and outside orders. This was a great opportunity to learn about the glass, from melting it to making work with it, and also discovering that every color had its own personality. As good as we got at making glass like it was done in the old days, we could not make enough profit to offset the cost of running the studio. So it was decided that Joe and I would start developing a line of blown glass that we could take to the market and try to sell through our stores. Some of the work was traditional pieces inspired by museum pieces. Some were more modern. We hired Jeff Sammartino and Michael Cavallero and set about training them to assist us. So instead of me and Joe stopping to assist each other throughout the day, we each got to work the full day on our own work, which actually doubled production. That's probably why in the pictures you see in the old shops, the crews are always 4, 5, 6, or 7 people, because they learned each job had the optimum amount of people for it to run the smoothest, which is, of course, the goal for all of them. The goal was to start doing some wholesale shows to try to create more money. By 1980, we got into a few major shows and started taking some orders. So in 1980, Curtis Zimmerman, who was running what was left of the Wheaton Industries hand shop, was brought in with Bobby Hoffman to try to help produce more work. So Bobby and Wayne kept doing the dump out and mold work that we were also doing, which freed us up to then do more of the blown work that we were involved with. Tony DePalma was hired, and he and Henry were making some of the traditional paperweights for the stores. In the middle of all this activity, we would support some special demonstrations. My earliest memory is Doug Merritt from Vandermark Studios doing a demo about making a lily pad pitchers and bowls. The best part was that he never sat down. I had never seen this before. Doing all the shaping, standing up at the marver and over a yoke. This is the first time I was to witness this technique. It added a certain speed to the process. Jerry Vandermark, who taught Doug how to blow glass, was old school. Having worked in several different factories during his career, he helped rebuild the old Jamestown site, trained the staff how to make the early reproductions that were sold in the gift shops. He stayed and worked with us and shared some techniques that improved our skills. I was starting to realize that glass blowing included many tricks of the trade. And when you reach a certain skill level, you can realize what the trick is and add it to your own bag of skills. Also during this time, we were still doing a lot of demonstrations for the school groups that were coming through. In 1980, I was commissioned by the New Jersey State Council on the Arts to build a portable furnace to take to Stockton College. This would be my first portable furnace of many that I would end up building over the years. So I built the furnace so Ted could do some demonstrations. Ted was a retired old timer who was a representative of our era of time slowly disappearing. He made some pitchers and creamers and little vases that day, but also showed me another little trick that I had not seen before in my short career. After placing the spout on the pitcher, he would put a little chalk mark on the inside across from the spout so that when the hot glass was brought to place the handle, he had a visual spot where to put it, which really helped lining up your handle to your spout a whole lot less easier. So also in 1980, Curtis hired Tom Zinski from Downer Glass. Tom had a small shop in his yard where he had a double chamber oil-fired furnace. He worked one side down making bottles. The other side would be melting glass for tomorrow. The shop was very tight, but that's the way, it was that way on purpose. He felt the less steps he took to make a bottle, the more bottles he could make in a day. So Tom was hired to make more bottles for Ed Johnson, or Holly City Art Glass at the time. The first thing he did was to reduce the size of the opening of the glory hole door and add a little oxygen line to the burner. By adding the oxygen line, he got the fire inside the glory hole much hotter than we were used to working with, which shortened the time you had to stand there to heat the lip. Again, once you saw it and participated in it, it made a lot of sense. By now I was realizing that in the old houses, you had daily quotas. If a team could figure out how to make more pieces per shift, the team would get a little part of that extra production, a kind of bonus that benefited not only the workers, but the company as well. So all the tricks had a purpose, and that was to make more of a better product easier. Periodically, we would have some locals from the glass community drop in to give words of encouragement. The likes of Paul Stanker, whose personal career was starting to take off. Jim and Nonitz Contis, who were owners of a large scientific glass production company and paperweight makers, as well as Ray and Bob Bamford, who were both paperweight makers as well as dealers. Here's a few pictures of me and Joe, each gaffing a piece. As Paul, you can see his color rods are laying out there, started doing some experimental drawings on the surface of these pieces. And again, I think Paul was coming down to also show us other techniques that we hadn't seen that maybe we would incorporate into our own work one day. Ray Bamford would also stop in fairly often and would show us some other paperweights and early pieces from Durand, again, to help educate us on the possibility of what can be done with glass. And when I first started making roses, he purchased some of the early ones, again, I believe for encouragement. I believe there's another slide of Bobby Bamford. And I think this must be at one of the first paperweight weekends. That's still a picture of Gene Crabtree behind him. So it had to be early on, probably before I even started working. As the last generation of the old-time glass blowers that I knew were retiring, a new group of glass worker artists were starting to enter my life. My journey was starting to change. One of the last memories I have of Henry Davis was him stepping in and showing us how to blow a large 2-foot Budweiser bottle. Joe and I were taking turns, getting 3 or 4 gathers at a time, shaping them in the block, running them over to the mold. They were blowing out crooked. They were dropping off the pipe and hitting the floor. We were really kind of out of our league. Henry walked over, asked if he could help. We said, sure. The first thing he did was turn the furnace down to 1900 degrees. And he said, when it reaches temperature, come get me. He went back out making paperweights. Once the furnace got the temperature, Henry came back. He got his first gather, let it cold, put a nice bubble into it. Went back in for the second gather. By turning the glass down, we realized that allowed him to get all the glass he needed for this job in 2 gathers instead of 4. So of course, again, there you're saving some time. Henry gathered the second gather, put it in the cast iron block, turned it until he felt it was the right temperature to start breaking loose, put a little air into it, walked up the steps to the 2-foot mold, hung it down. Joe closed the mold. Henry's cheeks popped up like he was blowing into a trombone. And we had a perfect bottle. Henry did about 3 or 4 more for us, smiled, handed me the pipe, and said, have at it, boys. And that's what we did. That was a really great learning experience. Briefly, before I was also hired in the shop, Flora Mace was working in the shop trying to help develop some stuff. And I believe the next 2 shots are pictures of Flora working with Tony. I mean, working with Henry. There you go. So Flora was laying out one of her designs. She was drawing with rods of glass and making different designs. Some of them were looking through windows and stuff. And she did quite a bit of experiments with Henry, as well as Wayne Hopman. And I think that venture only lasted about a year. But I do believe one year she did make a limited edition snowman paperweight for our Christmas paperweights. In the spring of 1983, I believe we had about 12 employees in the studio. Several different furnaces that we charged frequently, and it was still not able to create the cash flow to pay for the cost of operating the factory. After a few board meetings and retreats, much deliberation, it was decided to reduce the operating costs of the studio by laying most of us off, and at this point, a major change in direction of what Wheaton Village would become. Jeff and Tony and myself were kept on to entertain and educate the public. Also, it would be the beginning of the Creative Glass Center of America. Contemporary artists from around the world were invited to apply by submitting slides of their work and statements about how they would use the shop. To date, we have awarded over 370 fellowships to artists from 26 countries. Even though the fellowships have changed by the length of time, the first couple of years, they were 5 months long. Now some are 6 weeks or shorter because not every artist could walk away from the studio or family, in some cases for a long period of time. Here's a picture of Paul, younger Paul with Cy Kamens. Cy was the first director of the Creative Glass Center, president of the Creative Glass Center, and they were both responsible. They were at that meeting with Frank and the other board members when they decided to take this new direction. The things in the studio were definitely going to change. The studio would be changing for the next 10 years. We needed so much different equipment to facilitate the needs for these artists. They all came to us with different needs, different skill sets, different techniques. Different types of annealers were needed. New cold shop, an area to photograph their work. As we built more annealers, we eventually removed the industrial running Lear from the shop and built private studios in that space. We added pieces of equipment here and there. And the folks in that group you see there were the first group of fellows, and they actually were with us for 7 months because in the middle of their fellowship, we actually had a little, I guess, storm come through that should shut the factory down for 4 or 5 days. But also we realized after the program started, we didn't really have the facilities for them to use at the level they were capable of. So we extended that, and they also helped us build some of that equipment. All this change would require funding. We learned about writing grants. We started hosting Glass Lovers Weekend, where we would bring nationally known artists like Dale Chihuly, Gianni Tonso, Lino Tagliapietra. Here's a picture of Dale, again with Frank Jr., who was around for the whole weekend. And here's the first crew Dale came to town with. We actually hosted Dale here on 3 different occasions. And each time he had to assemble and bring in a crew of highly skilled people to come in and help produce his work. Gianni Toso was here several times. Billy Morris, There's Lino working with Dan Daly, another internationally known glass designer. He came in for a week. He actually hired Lino. Lino came back to work for Dale, and Lino then came back to do his own work. So what a privilege to have these gifted artists working here in Millville, New Jersey. While this was slowly happening for the regular staff, Tony was now a full-time employee. There's Dante and there's Gianni. Tony making different paperweights for the visitors. I learned as a young man, Tony worked in one of the local glass shops as an assistant. He did this for a few years before the Second World War. He served his time in the service, and when he got out, he decided to open a tailor clothing store downtown Millville until he retired. This was when he started working for us at Wheaton Village. He took a vacation to Italy and toured some of the glass houses, and over there decided he wanted to get back and start playing with the glass. His desire was to perfect the process of making the Millville rose. He got to see some roses made when he was a young man working in the glass house. And like Henry Davis, Tony brought his lunch every day. He would sit at the bench eating his lunch while he was making a rose or another one of his creations. That would be my first introduction into witnessing the complicated process of rose making. He was very proud of his roses. It was also previously mentioned that Jim and Nanas Contis would come to the studio every now and then. They're always interested in what we were doing, always offering and encouraging advice. One of their visits, they presented me with my first rose crimp. After that, I'm not sure what year this was, but I started playing around with the crimp. And I had watched Tony make his leaves. I had watched Tony push his crimp through the colored glass dropped on the end of the clear cylinder. And again, I was fortunate. I was able to watch the process and then mimic his moves. After a number of failures, I finally made a decent rose. Tony was there as it was removed from the annealer. He saw my first rose, and instead of being excited for me, he was actually a little upset. He told me that he was hoping that we would all wait for him to retire, and then he would pass the torch on to us. And I told him I didn't think I could wait that long because I didn't see him leaving or going anywhere for a number of years. We both smiled and moved on. And this was probably sometime in the mid 80s, and Tony didn't retire until the year 2000. There was the crimp and some of the roses that I got to make, and I'm still making with that same crimp. 1981 to 1983 was a very busy time, so I need to mention a few more individuals that became part of my journey. First is Gordon Smith, who started working in the Lampwork studio. Oh, here's a piece I did with Sketch, a collaborative piece. He took one of my roses and placed it in the center of one of his Radicello bowls, a beautiful little piece that hopefully we'll get a chance to pursue as time allows. First, Gordon Smith, who started working in a lamp workshop in Crafts and Trades Row. Like Paul Stankert, he worked in scientific glass, but saw other possibilities in a more creative material. He would stop in his studio, and if we had a nice color in the furnace, he might ask to pull some rod to play with later, or he would pull some clear and go back to the flame working studio where he would start encapsulating pieces in little pendants and stuff for his next, as he was building up his skills. After a few years of working in the flame shop, an elder gentleman came by one day, and his name was John Parsley. John was hooked, and for the next couple of years would become a regular visitor to the studio, and like Gordon, was always interested in what colors we might have in our furnace. I would pull some rods for John in the evening, and if he liked the color, give them to him on his next visit, and then he would go home and figure out how he could incorporate them into his paperweights. John also went on to become a very wonderful paperweight maker. At this point, I'm starting to realize that Wheaton Village was kind of a magnet for creative people. In the summer of '83, Jeff Anneman started volunteering in the studio, helping Tony in a way he could. Jeff was an antique bottle jar collector who wanted to learn how to blow glass. A year later, he would introduce Frank Stubbins to the studio, and they would become the foundation for what would become the Wheaton Village traveling glass blowers. Here's the first setup of us on a Tuesday night. It's Frank to the left, Jeff holding up the blowpipe, me, and then to the right is Donald Pettifer, who was I believe, the director of collections at the time. and was very, very much interested in it. He actually had a trailer for a boat that he donated to us. And on that trailer, we built our first traveling furnace. Jeff and Frank would come down and practice with me on Tuesday nights. They often brought photographs or books with them to show me things that they were interested in. And when I had time, I would sit down and figure it out with them and pass it on. They came in and did a few weekends with us in the shop. And if some of the people who were interested in the more historical work asked them if they would come or if they could do a demonstration on site. And that was the birth of the traveling glass blowers. I built a new furnace and annealer. We packed a bench on there with the tools they needed, gave them batch, and on the road we went. For the first couple of years, I had the privilege of going out with them. I was the guy who got to drive the van and pull the furnace to every place we went. So over the years, I guess they've been doing this since 1985. So you're talking almost 15, 20 years. Marie Stubbins would go out with them on the road, and she would set up tables to sell the work that was made the week before. And by doing that, we kept a supply of funds going back to help the operation of the studio. There was cost involved with going on the road. Now, here you're going to see a few pieces that I made doing demos for them. This is a few powder horns. There should be some other assorted bottles. The clear piece was made in the studio, but all the colored pieces were pieces that I would have done as a demo on the road for them. If they wanted to see rigory like you see in the handles, apply bits, the poor attempt at a chicken on top of the head there, that was probably my first. And then here's a couple bottle flasks that were done for different demos, and 2 sugar jars with slightly better chickens on top. They look more like wild turkeys, I'd say. So sadly today, the group is down to Frank and his son, Wes, and their 2 wives, but they still do go out on the road. But during the heyday, they traveled to 46 different locations. They did Head Creek, Morgantown for 25 years, the Cooktown Folk Festival for 19 years. We did the Philadelphia Folk Festival for probably a good 10 years. Sadly, Jim and Harry have passed on, and Jeff retired from the group. But Jeff now has a glass studio on his property where he rents out studio space and does some classes. So he gets to play now and when he still gets the urge. Sometimes in the mid-'80s, we received a call from Matt Farabella. Matt had an old shop in Milmay, and as Gay mentioned, it was known as the Italian Club. I didn't know it then, but early on, every once in a while on a Friday afternoon, Bill Valla would disappear from the shop. He would have Wayne Hopman take him to the Italian Club. And here I thought it was some kind of like local Irish drinking club or Italian drinking club where members of the community got together. But in fact, it was a glass shop. They would pool their resources, get together and work for a couple days, making different stuff. If they weren't working, they might be cooking for the other fellas. They had a beautiful kitchen on site that had 2 refrigerators. One was for a keg of beer and the other one was for their food. Beautiful stainless steel kitchen. So they would get together for 2, 3, 4 days. They would blow glass around the clock, taking shifts, eat, and enjoy each other company. I think I'd fit right in with that group today. So we did, and I do believe we did pick up a press or 2 from Matt Farabella that is now part of our collection. We ended up giving a large bottle job to Skip Woods, who had what was probably the last South Jersey production hand shop to close its doors. But in the good days, he had 2 shifts making all kinds of pressed or blown glass for a number of clients. We got to go out, watch him make the bottles for the first time. And I noticed that he had a big pit dug in the floor. And the mold was down in the pit. So when he got to the mold with the glass to make the bottle, all he did was hang it in the pit, make the bottle, and then lift it back out. It was so much easier than what we were doing, climbing up and down the stairs. But as I mentioned before, the whole business is a game of tricks. And once you learn them or you see them, then you can incorporate them into your work. So you can see that in the 1990s, there was still a handful of small studios scattered about South Jersey. Today, there are 2 contemporary studios that are still occasionally lit up. One is Rich and Karen Federici's up in Vineland, behind their house. They have a beautiful studio. And the other is behind Jeff Veneman house in Clayton, New Jersey. Even though you would see them making more contemporary pieces there, they are carrying on the tradition of running a glass shop in South Jersey. Rich still occasionally does some roses in his shop, and I've been out doing a few bottle jobs in Jeff's shop with him and a small crew. So as the Creative Glass Center settled in and many of the studio's issues resolved, I was still actively involved with studio production. Joe Mattson eventually became part of the staff again. We hired Melanie Gerdsey, late David Lewin, both who had past fellows. They stayed for a while until they were able to establish themselves in the art glass world, went on and built their own studios, and both are still active today. I stole Jennifer Pagliarini from the store staff. She would come visit us at lunch. She was very interested. So every time someone would leave, we'd have to bring someone else in and we'd have to start retraining them. I was only as good as the skills level of the assistant I had to work with me. And you'll see the next piece is probably the last piece. Well, there's Jennifer bringing me a foot for a more complicated piece. And then the next piece is probably the last piece that Jennifer and I made together. This was a series of work that we had just started, but because she left, I couldn't make it anymore with the assistants that I had. In order for the teams that we worked in not to stop to do all the shows, we eventually reached out for people who are willing to come and volunteer as narrators. And our first two main narrators were David Horn and then Ken Brown. Here these two gentlemen are. They both spent many hours in the shop with us, entertaining us. David traveled from just outside of Philadelphia with his wife once a week, and Ken traveled once a week from north of Philadelphia for 8 years, eventually putting 70,000 miles on his car because he gave us a running tab every time he came in. Ken eventually started making some paperweights. As an antique paperweight collector, he was curious. So he set up a little torch at home in his house and he would make some parts and he would come down, and when we broke for lunch, he would get to set his parts up onto a hot plate and play around and make some of his own creations. Over the years, many volunteers would come into the shop on a weekly basis to do narrations for us, so we could concentrate on making work for the visitors and for orders. The volunteers would become an essential part of the daily functioning of the studio then as well as today. Some have been with us for over 25 years, and I can't thank them all enough. Another fun project was taking on the challenge of making the world's largest bottle. At the point when we discussed it, we invited Steve Oben, who was a past fellow, down with his crew because he had a shop running up in north of Pennsylvania, so he was still actively working. This is the original crew. I actually had to build a special furnace because we couldn't get the glass we needed out of our furnace. The door opening was too small. So I did that. They came down and practiced for a while. I think the next two slides are actually photos of the process. There we are with the gather. You can see the guy on the right there has a bar. In order for us to get the glass, it probably weighed about 80 pounds from the furnace back to the bench. We had to set it onto a bar. Once we shaped it, we put a little neck into it. We had a forklift set up. The second picture to the right is actually the bottle getting ready to come out of the forklift. You can see the smoke. That was a little bit of a mold that we made. And it was going to be laid down into that harness there so that then we can carry it over to the annealer, because these had to be annealed as well. So we did 3 or 4 practice sessions. The weekend of the event, the very first bottle we made was the bottle that eventually would go on to break the Guinness Book of Records. And there's a 193-gallon bottle right there. And that's still on display in our museum. So we're almost to the end of the story here. In the midst of all this, I was able to establish myself as an artist. I received a few grants, showed my work in galleries, had a one-man show at the State Museum in Trenton. Maybe you can start slowly going through some of these slides, Marcy. I had a piece of my work published in 1992 in New Glass Review, a yearly glass publication that comes out once a year. But for me, the best part of the journey was the people. The staff at Wheaton's, the fellows, all the local artists I met, the local support community and collectors. Without all involved, my journey would have been a different one for sure. So here's some of the pieces that I got to play around and make with during my career at WheatonArts. This is one similar to the one that was published in the New Glass Review. Different techniques that I had experimented with over the years. And you can see they're all, you know, they all have a different focus, but I got very curious. And again, I saw so many different things and approaches by the fellows that I was anxious to try as many different techniques as I could. This is actually all powdered glass laid out onto a steel table that then I poured a ladle of glass on top and then wrapped that around the vessel itself. Now, these next three shots is an old body of work that I decided to go back to after I retired. These are imitation little Roman vessels that I had made. And what I'm actually doing is burying them into the sand so I can bring them up in the oven and pour hot glass over them. Here's one digging out the little archaeological piece. And the next piece should be the piece after being washed off and cleaned up. There's a little bit more work to do. So this is what I'm doing with my retirement, trying to still stay actively engaged. Even though I retired 2 years ago, I was still coming to the studio to help when I could and to get to play with the glass, trying to perfect the process of improving how I make the Millville rose. Here's a picture of the of me working with a rose with the help of Skitch. Last fall, we started attempting to make the world's largest rose. I believe we were pretty close to it, but then we were shut down because of COVID. Pre-COVID, we were practicing making the rose. Hopefully we can get back to that after COVID is over. At the age of 70, I still have no interest in seeing this journey end. Thank you.
Don, thank you so much. That was absolutely fabulous. Hearing your story, which is also the history of Wheaton. It was just fantastic.
Yeah, I think there's so much more to the story that could be talked in a different format.
I'm sure. It's hard to put everything into 30 minutes. Rita had a question for you. Do you make your own crimps?
No. I have three actually in my collection. One was given to me by Jim and Nana's Contis. Another one was given to me by the nephew of one of the Makkos that I've made a few with. And the other one, Gay kind of lent to me 40 years ago and I just never gave it back to her.
She's very kind, isn't she?
Yeah. And they were all crimp roses that were set in plaster inside of an old contadina tomato paste cans. So that was pre-machine shop.
Oh, but it worked.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, and one more question. In the 1984 photo of the Wheaton mobile glass blowers, it looks like Don Pettifer is holding the specialized 4-prong tool for making Jacob's ladders.
Yes.
Okay, that's great.
I actually made that tool so that we could make some Jacob's ladders because Frank and Jeff wanted to see them made.
That's fantastic.
Making them on their own for other demos.
Mary, this is David Cohen. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually have a comment in regard to both Don and Gay's presentations. They mentioned Ted Ramp, and I wanted to indicate that in the book Pineland's Folklife that Rita, Sammy, Lorraine Williams, and I edited, there is a series of photographs done in 1970 of Ted Ramp at work, and they were taken by William Augustine, who was a South Jersey photographer, and his works are all a part of a collection at the Rutgers University Archive.
Oh, I think, thank you for adding that. And I think Marcy has pulled up the image now.
Yeah, actually, I'm looking at that image. I believe that might be a snap.
Yeah, there's snap.
It's
There's
a snap
snaps.
holding the bottle.
There's snaps.
Yeah. But we did eventually make that tool that Frank still has for making the Jacob's ladder.
I've seen him do that, and we've excavated lots and lots of little segments of Jacob's ladders in Kensington. So it's definitely part of the tradition here. Okay, I don't believe there are any more questions, but lots of comments about your marvelous career. And thank you so much, Don. It was really a perfect way to bring a close to this conference.
Well, thank you all for letting me participate.